In June 1967, the world stood on the edge of a dramatic transformation, and the Middle East was about to become the stage of one of the most intense and swift conflicts in modern military history. The Six-Day War, also known as the June War or the Third Arab-Israeli War, unfolded with shocking speed. In just 6 days, Israel confronted the combined forces of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and what followed would reshape the balance of power in the region for decades to come. To understand why this war happened and why it ended the way it did, we need to step back into the tense atmosphere of the 1960s. The Middle East was already boiling with political disputes, territorial tensions, and the aftermath of earlier wars. The Arab states, still bitter from their loss in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, had long promised to reverse that defeat. Israel, on the other hand, was determined to defend its existence at any cost, surrounded by enemies and outnumbered in both men and machines. The stage for confrontation was set, but the spark would come from a series of escalating moves in 1967. Egypt, under the leadership of President Gamal Abdel Nasser, was determined to assert itself as the leader of the Arab world. Nasser was charismatic, ambitious, and deeply committed to the idea of pan-Arab unity. For him, the destruction of Israel was both a political goal and a way to cement his reputation across the Middle East. In May 1967, he took a step that would push the region toward open war. He ordered the removal of United Nations peacekeeping forces from the Sinai Peninsula. These peacekeepers had been stationed there since 1956 to prevent clashes between Israel and Egypt. Without them, the frontier between the two states was suddenly open and exposed. At the same time, Nasser closed the Straits of Tiran, a vital sea passage for Israel's trade. For Israel, this was more than a provocation. It was considered an act of war. Meanwhile, Israel watched nervously as Arab armies mobilized. Egyptian divisions poured into the Sinai Desert. Jordan, led by King Hussein, signed a defense pact with Egypt, binding its army to Nasser's cause. Syria, already hostile and emboldened, placed its forces on alert along the northern border. From Israel's perspective, it was being encircled by hostile neighbors, each promising to wipe it off the map. Propaganda across Arab capitals called for the liberation of Palestine, and radio broadcasts declared that the final battle against Israel was near. Ordinary Israelis lived under a cloud of fear, preparing for the possibility of a second Holocaust. The sense of urgency in the air was overwhelming. Israel's leaders debated their options: wait for the Arabs to strike first, or launch a preemptive strike to break the encirclement. Every hour felt like the ticking of a clock toward inevitable war. Inside Israel, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol and his cabinet were under immense pressure. Citizens demanded action, generals pushed for decisive moves, and the entire nation was gripped by anxiety. In the end, Israel made its choice. On the morning of June 5, 1967, Israeli jets took off in a surprise preemptive strike, beginning one of the most astonishing military operations of the 20th century. In a matter of hours, the course of the war and the future of the Middle East would change forever. This was the beginning of the Six-Day War, and its story is one of daring strategy, overwhelming speed, and consequences that still shape global politics today. The morning of June 5, 1967, began like any other across the Arab world, but within hours, everything changed. At exactly 7:45 a.m., the Israeli Air Force launched Operation Focus. Nearly the entire Israeli air fleet took to the skies in a meticulously planned assault, flying low across the Mediterranean and the desert to avoid radar detection. Their target was not enemy soldiers on the ground, nor even tanks or artillery. It was the Arab air forces. Israel's leaders had calculated that if they could destroy enemy aircraft while still parked on the ground, they could win the skies and guarantee victory on the battlefield. What followed was a devastating blow that stunned the Arab armies. Egyptian air bases, caught completely by surprise, were hammered one after another. Runways were cratered, planes burned on the tarmac, and hangars collapsed in flames. By the end of the day, Egypt's proud air force was reduced to rubble. Out of its hundreds of planes, more than 300 were destroyed in a single strike. Jordan and Syria fared no better. Their bases, too, were struck with surgical precision. In less than 24 hours, Israel had achieved what military planners around the world considered nearly impossible: complete air superiority. The Arab soldiers in the desert looked to the skies for cover from their own jets, but none came. Instead, Israeli aircraft now roamed freely, bombing convoys, armored divisions, and supply lines. For the soldiers on the ground, the psychological impact was immense. They felt abandoned and exposed, while the Israelis gained the confidence of knowing they owned the skies. With the air war decided, Israel shifted its focus to the ground campaign. The Sinai Peninsula became the first theater of operations. Egyptian forces had deployed heavily in this vast desert, expecting to confront Israeli divisions head-on. But Israeli commanders, led by General Ariel Sharon and others, had devised bold maneuvers that combined speed, deception, and daring attacks. Tanks and infantry units raced across the desert, bypassing strong points, cutting off reinforcements, and encircling Egyptian divisions. In the fierce Battle of Abu-Ageila, Sharon's forces executed a brilliant night assault, breaching well-fortified positions and shattering Egyptian morale. Within days, entire Egyptian armies were retreating in chaos, leaving behind weapons, vehicles, and even their comrades. The desert was littered with the wreckage of a broken army. Meanwhile, Jordan had joined the war as promised. King Hussein's forces launched artillery strikes on West Jerusalem and moved to capture strategic ground. For the Jordanians, it was both a matter of honor and survival. They could not stand aside while their allies fought Israel. Yet this decision would prove costly. The Israeli Defense Forces responded with overwhelming force, launching counterattacks that pushed Jordanian troops back. The most symbolic and painful loss for Jordan came in East Jerusalem, including the Old City. In fierce urban battles, Israeli paratroopers fought street by street, house by house, until finally they reached the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, Jews had regained control of their ancient capital. The images of soldiers weeping at the wall, touching its stones, and praying in exhaustion and joy became some of the most iconic moments of the entire war. As the battles raged in Jerusalem and Sinai, the northern front against Syria also erupted. For years, Syrian artillery had shelled Israeli villages in the Galilee from their commanding positions on the Golan Heights. Now, with war fully underway, Israel decided to eliminate that threat once and for all. But the Golan Heights were not easily conquered. They were a natural fortress, with steep cliffs, minefields, and heavily dug-in Syrian positions. Still, Israeli forces advanced with determination. Fighting uphill against tanks and fortified bunkers, the battles were brutal and bloody. Yet the Israelis pressed on, driven by the knowledge that every step forward would free their civilians from years of bombardment. By the sixth day of the war, the Golan Heights had fallen into Israeli hands, completing the astonishing sweep of victories. The Arab world was left in shock. 6 days earlier, leaders had spoken of destroying Israel, of driving its people into the sea. Now, Israel had tripled its territory, seizing the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. For the Arab states, the humiliation was profound. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan had not only been defeated but embarrassed in front of the entire world. Their armies were shattered, their pride wounded, and their people left to question how such a disaster could have happened so quickly. In Arab capitals, anger boiled, not only against Israel but also against their own leaders, who had promised victory but delivered catastrophe. For Israel, the victory was euphoric but also sobering. The war had secured its survival, at least for the moment, and transformed it into a regional power. Yet it also left Israel in control of vast new territories filled with millions of Palestinians and other Arabs. What was supposed to be a quick defense of national survival had created a whole new set of challenges, questions about occupation, governance, and peace that remain unresolved to this day. The Six-Day War had ended, but its consequences were only beginning. When the guns finally fell silent on June 10, 1967, the Middle East was no longer the same. The war that had begun with threats of annihilation ended in one of the swiftest and most decisive victories in modern history. Israel stood triumphant, its territory vastly expanded, its enemies stunned and humiliated. But behind the smoke of the battlefield and the lines on the new maps, the human cost of those 6 days could not be ignored. Thousands of soldiers lay dead, families grieved their losses, and millions of civilians were suddenly living under new rulers. For the Arab world, the defeat was almost impossible to process. Leaders who had promised victory and liberation now faced angry populations demanding answers. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, the towering figure of Arab nationalism, shocked his nation by announcing his resignation on June 9. Crowds poured into the streets of Cairo, not to celebrate his departure, but to beg him to stay. For many Arabs, even in defeat, Nasser remained a symbol of dignity and defiance. Still, the aura of Arab unity that he had worked so hard to build was shattered. Egypt had lost the Sinai, Jordan had lost the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and Syria had lost the Golan Heights. The dream of destroying Israel had turned into a nightmare of territorial loss and national humiliation. Ordinary Arab soldiers carried deep scars from the war. Survivors of the Sinai retreat told stories of chaos and betrayal. Many felt abandoned by their commanders, who fled the battlefield while leaving foot soldiers behind. In Jordan, veterans who had fought bravely in Jerusalem were bitter that they had been overwhelmed by superior firepower and left to face Israeli tanks and paratroopers without adequate support. Syrian soldiers on the Golan remembered the desperation of fighting against overwhelming odds, watching comrades fall while realizing their defensive lines could not hold. Across the Arab world, these stories fueled resentment, anger, and a desire for revenge that would shape the region for decades. On the Israeli side, the mood was dramatically different but equally complex. For soldiers who had fought in Jerusalem, the moment of reaching the Western Wall was one of spiritual triumph. Many wept openly, overcome by the weight of history. In the Sinai, Israeli tank crews celebrated their astonishing success, having captured thousands of enemy vehicles and pushed their foes across the Suez Canal. On the Golan, exhausted infantry units stood atop the heights they had stormed, looking down at the Galilee villages that would no longer fear Syrian shells. Israel had not only survived, but had changed its destiny. Yet even in victory, Israeli soldiers also carried memories of fallen comrades. Graves were dug, names were remembered, and families mourned those who had paid the ultimate price. The international community reacted with a mix of awe, concern, and urgency. Military analysts marveled at Israel's lightning campaign, studying its use of surprise, air power, and maneuver warfare as a model for future conflicts. At the same time, world leaders worried about the instability that followed. The United Nations quickly called for a ceasefire and began drafting resolutions to address the new reality. Resolution 242, which would become central to all future peace negotiations, emphasized the principle of land for peace, that Israel should withdraw from territories captured in the war in exchange for recognition and security guarantees from the Arab states. But in practice, this principle would prove difficult to implement. Among Palestinians, the war was another turning point in a long and painful struggle. Hundreds of thousands were displaced once again, fleeing from the West Bank and Gaza into neighboring Jordan, Lebanon, and beyond. Refugee camps swelled with new arrivals, their lives uprooted by yet another round of conflict. For many Palestinians, the war deepened the sense that they could not rely on Arab governments to achieve liberation. Out of this frustration grew new movements, including the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, which increasingly turned to armed struggle as the path forward. The events of 1967 laid the foundation for decades of resistance, insurgency, and negotiations that continue to this day. The psychological impact of the Six-Day War was just as significant as the territorial changes. In Israel, the sense of vulnerability that had gripped the nation before the war gave way to confidence, even pride. A small country, surrounded by larger enemies, had fought back and won. But that same victory also bred overconfidence, creating the belief that Israel could rely on military strength alone to ensure its survival. This belief would be tested just 6 years later, during the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack to avenge their defeat. In the Arab world, the loss created what came to be known as the Naksa, or setback. It was not just a military defeat, but a psychological and cultural wound. Artists, writers, and poets expressed the despair and anger of a generation that had believed in the promise of Arab unity only to see it shattered in less than a week. Across Cairo, Damascus, and Amman, whispers of betrayal circulated, that leaders had failed their people, that corruption and arrogance had doomed their armies, and that something new was needed to restore Arab honor. For the world's superpowers, the Six-Day War was also a warning. The United States and the Soviet Union, deeply involved in the Cold War, had both supported their respective allies in the Middle East. The lightning victory showed how quickly regional wars could escalate into global crises. Both superpowers rushed to resupply their partners, setting the stage for an arms race in the region that would continue for decades. The Middle East, already important for its oil and strategic location, became an even more dangerous flashpoint in global politics. By the end of June 1967, the dust had settled, but nothing was truly resolved. Israel now controlled territories that gave it strategic depth, but also entangled it in new conflicts with millions of Palestinians and neighboring states. The Arab nations, though defeated, were not ready to accept peace on Israel's terms. In September of that year, they gathered at the Khartoum summit and declared the famous 3 no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. With that declaration, the hope of a quick settlement faded, and the region braced itself for further confrontation. The Six-Day War had lasted less than a week, but its impact would last for generations. Borders had shifted, ideologies had been shaken, and new conflicts had been born. For the soldiers who fought, the memories of those days remained etched in their hearts. The roar of jets overhead, the chaos of battle, the triumphs, the defeats, and the knowledge that they had witnessed history unfold in real time. The Six-Day War of 1967 ended quickly, but its consequences have echoed for more than half a century. It was not just a military confrontation. It was a turning point in the history of the Middle East, reshaping borders, politics, and the lives of millions of people. When the war began, many believed it would be a long and bloody struggle, but instead, it became one of the swiftest and most decisive conflicts of the modern age. Israel had tripled its size in less than a week, capturing the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. These territorial changes created new realities that continue to define the region even today. For Israel, the victory was nothing short of extraordinary. A nation that had feared annihilation now felt a new sense of security and confidence. Ordinary Israelis, who had lived with the constant fear of being surrounded by hostile neighbors, suddenly believed in their military strength as a shield for their survival. For many, it was seen as a miracle, a small country defeating much larger armies in only 6 days. The capture of East Jerusalem, especially the Old City with its holy sites, was perhaps the most emotional moment of all. Images of Israeli soldiers standing at the Western Wall went around the world, symbolizing not only military success, but also spiritual triumph. Yet, this victory also created dilemmas that Israel has wrestled with ever since. By holding territories populated by millions of Palestinians, Israel entered into a new phase of conflict that could not be solved by battlefield victories alone. On the other side, the Arab world was left devastated, humiliated, and searching for answers. The dream of Arab unity under leaders like Nasser had been shattered. The loss of territory was not just strategic, but symbolic. For Egyptians, the fall of the Sinai was a wound that could not be forgotten. For Jordanians, the loss of the West Bank and East Jerusalem was a blow to their national identity. For Syrians, the loss of the Golan Heights was both a military and psychological scar. The Arab defeat became known as the Naksa, or setback, a word that carried deep meaning for millions of Arabs who felt betrayed by their governments and humiliated before the world. The defeat sparked changes in Arab societies. In Egypt, despite the initial anger, people still rallied around Nasser, unwilling to abandon the leader who had symbolized Arab pride. In Jordan, King Hussein faced enormous pressure, but he remained in power, determined to recover what had been lost. In Syria, the bitterness of the loss fueled the rise of new leaders who promised revenge. Across the region, armies began to rebuild, rearming with Soviet support, while populations prepared themselves for the possibility of another war. The sense of unfinished business hung heavily in the air. For Palestinians, the Six-Day War was another chapter of displacement and despair. Refugees who had fled in 1948 now saw themselves pushed out again, joining camps in Jordan, Lebanon, and elsewhere. The occupation of the West Bank and Gaza meant that millions of Palestinians now lived under Israeli control, and this reality gave rise to a new phase of resistance. The Palestine Liberation Organization, which had existed before 1967, grew in influence and shifted toward armed struggle as the only path forward. For many Palestinians, the lesson of 1967 was clear. They could no longer rely on Arab governments to deliver liberation. They would have to fight for themselves. This mindset fueled decades of conflict, from guerrilla campaigns to uprisings known as intifadas. The global impact of the Six-Day War was also profound. For the United States, Israel's stunning victory reinforced its role as a key ally in the region. Washington began to deepen its support for Israel, seeing it as a partner against Soviet influence in the Middle East. For the Soviet Union, the war was a setback, as its Arab allies had been defeated despite heavy investment in weapons and training. The Cold War rivalry now became deeply intertwined with Middle Eastern politics, ensuring that future conflicts would always risk escalating into superpower confrontations. In the years following the war, efforts at peace emerged but often fell short. The United Nations passed Resolution 242, calling for Israel to withdraw from territories occupied during the conflict in exchange for peace with its neighbors. But the Arab states' declaration of the three no's at the Khartoum summit, no peace, no recognition, and no negotiations with Israel, showed how far away a settlement was. The war had hardened positions on both sides. Israel felt emboldened to hold on to its new territories, while the Arab states and Palestinians refused to accept the legitimacy of the Israeli state. This deadlock set the stage for the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack to try to reclaim their lost lands. For the soldiers who fought in 1967, the memories of those 6 days remained vivid throughout their lives. Israeli veterans often recalled the incredible speed of their victories, the feeling of unity, and the overwhelming relief of survival. Yet they also carried grief for their comrades who did not return home. Arab veterans, meanwhile, remembered the chaos of retreat, the pain of defeat, and the frustration of being let down by poor leadership and lack of coordination. Their stories, passed down through generations, kept the memory of the war alive in both pride and pain. Looking back today, more than half a century later, the Six-Day War stands as a pivotal moment in modern history. It demonstrated the power of military strategy, the importance of surprise, and the devastating consequences of miscalculation. It reshaped maps, redefined national identities, and left legacies that still shape negotiations, conflicts, and diplomacy in the Middle East. The war also taught a broader lesson about the nature of conflict. Victory on the battlefield does not always mean peace. Israel won the war, but in doing so, it inherited new challenges that continue to define its politics and society. The Arab states lost the war, but their desire to avenge that loss ensured that the cycle of conflict would continue. For the Palestinians, the war was both a disaster and the beginning of a new struggle for recognition and rights. As history remembers the Six-Day War, it is not only the maps that changed but the lives of millions who lived through it. Soldiers who marched across deserts, civilians who fled their homes, leaders who gambled with their nation's futures, and families who still visit the graves of those lost in battle. Their stories remind us that war is never just about territory, but about people. In the end, the Six-Day War lasted only 6 days, but its legacy continues to shape the destiny of the Middle East. It was a war of speed, shock, and consequences, a war that proved how quickly history can turn and how deeply its scars can last. For those who lived it, and for those who study it, the war remains a lesson of courage and fear, of triumph and loss, and of the reality that in war, nothing is ever truly finished.